Right, so let's talk about the 2020 election, because that's the best way to set this up and frame it. You had an election that took place after a tumultuous year and during a pandemic. And as a result of that, we saw widespread use of universal mail-in balloting across the country. Some states like ours had already used it enough to work out some of the kinks. Doesn't mean it was perfect, but in Utah we had decent signature verification standards. We had protocols in place to figure out how to deal with some of the problems. In a lot of parts of the country they didn't. So you had a lot of uncertainty about the election at the outset. Concerns were raised in a number of states about how mail-in balloting was used, how the ballots were counted, whether there was illegal ballot harvesting going on, and there were a lot of arguments going along different routes. It took us several days before we even knew the outcome of the election. I had a conversation with President Trump a few days after the election, before some of the states had even certified their results, and I encouraged him to do a couple things. I said, look, obviously exhaust your legal remedies under state law. Mercifully, it's states and not the federal government that conduct our elections. You don't ever want to see those consolidated in a national sovereign. That's bad news. That's how tyranny happens. And so it's under state law, and I said the remedies will be different under each state, but you've got a legal team. I'm sure your legal team will be able to identify what resources you've got as far as recounts, audits, or whatever else you want to do. But I said it's very important that you do this quickly, whatever you're going to do, because by mid-December, the Electoral College will meet, it will convene, and they will cast their votes. And at that point, that's pretty much the end of it. And it's very important that you acknowledge now that you'll accept whatever the results are of the Electoral College. Then over the next couple months, a lot of things happened, a lot of accusations were raised about different states. Very difficult to unwind an election after it has occurred, which is why it's so important that we always focus on our own state in real time, in anticipation of the next election year, even before we're in the thick of it. It's important that we do that because governments are run by human beings. We don't have access to angels. If we did, we wouldn't need a constitution. If we're not angels, if we were, we wouldn't need government at all. So we always have to anticipate that in any election there's going to be some fraud, or at least some attempts at fraud. In any large election, you can anticipate that some of that's going to occur. It's not whether, but how much and where, and what we can do about stopping it. So it's always important that we focus moving forward on making the elections as safe as possible. Once it's done, very difficult to unravel. Almost impossible, by the way, to prove which votes were fraudulently cast and which were not. Almost impossible. There were rumors circulating for months during the 2-month period between the election and January 6th. Remember, the election occurred on November 3rd, I think, in 2020. The Electoral College met in mid-December, I think it was December 16th, cast their votes, and then January 6th, Congress met to open and count the votes. In each state is the ultimate, not just the ultimate, but the exclusive decision maker when it comes to deciding who won the presidential election. And so we rely on states. In fact, it's not my decision to rely on states, it's the Constitution itself. As these arguments were being raised about states, and as we saw litigation not succeeding in these various states, particularly Georgia, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Nevada, and Arizona, those were the states most frequently brought up as states where there had been election fraud and where there were going to be challenges. Those challenges weren't succeeding in courts. And as they were not succeeding in courts, a lot of attention was all of a sudden put on Congress. Well, Congress can still fix this on January 6th. And so at that point, somewhere between late December and early January, when these arguments started being made, I thought, okay, well, I've got to make sure I understand what our role is. I've been part of this process where Congress opens the ballots and counts them before, but There had never been much of a contest before. And so I dusted out to make sure that I understood them properly. And they confirmed what I had suspected, which is, if you read Article 2, Section 1, Clause 2 of the Constitution, and then you read the 12th Amendment, those are the two provisions in the Constitution that inform what our role is. Congress's role is a ministerial one. It's a clerical one. Our sole job is to open and count the votes as they're received. The only time Congress has any role beyond that is if, well, there are a number of circumstances, including where nobody is able to get the requisite number of electoral votes. There are some very rare and narrow circumstances in which the House of Representatives will decide it. That's not what we were dealing with here. There are other rare circumstances that have only arisen a few times in our history. One with respect to the electoral votes of the state of Hawaii in 1960 in the Kennedy-Nixon election. Hawaii's election officials certified Nixon as the winner early in the day, the day following the presidential election. And later in the day, they had finished counting the votes and they decided they did it wrongly and that Kennedy had actually won. But in the meantime, they had already appointed a slate of Nixon electors. Those electors had submitted their ballots, cast their ballots, mailed them to Washington. Later in the day, they did the same thing. They said, oops, we messed up. Kennedy electors, you're up to bat. They cast their votes, they sent them. So Congress, in that circumstance, has a role. It's a minor role. Their role is to figure out which is the actual slate of delegates, or of electors, representing the actual victor in that state. Something similar happened with respect to 4 states in the Hayes-Tilden election of 1876. But in the absence of competing slates of electors, where you've got 2 slates of electors, one for one candidate, one for another candidate, from the same state, both with plausible claims to authenticity, in that circumstance, Congress has to figure out which is the actual true slate. Absent those circumstances, there is nothing for Congress to do other than open and count. As we approached January 6th, it became clearer and clearer to me that this was unambiguous. When the Electoral College convened and cast its votes in various states on, I think, December 16th, there was only one slate for each candidate. Each state appointed and had only one slate of electoral votes cast. And at that point, I issued a statement saying it appears Joe Biden is likely our next president in the absence of, the unlikely event of a court or a state legislature invalidating those electoral votes or rescinding its electoral votes. Then Joe Biden will be the president, and those votes will be counted accordingly on January 6th. So, and I informed people close to the president, including the White House Chief of Staff, of that at the time. Between December 16th and January 6th, rumors continued to circulate. Rumors suggesting, oh, well, this or that state is going to rescind its electoral votes. In theory, there is a way that that could happen. In fact, it's ultimately up to the state legislature. The state legislatures in each state are ultimately in charge of it. A scary thing, something we don't often recognize, but something I remembered when I reread Bush versus Gore in anticipation of this, is that the Constitution itself doesn't even require states to hold presidential elections. It simply says that the electoral votes of each state will be cast according to the specifications, according to the process set forth by that state legislature. In the early years of the Republic, under the Constitution, we actually had several presidential elections where the several states chose not to have an election. The state legislature just had some other method of choosing them. In any event, these rumors continued to circulate, suggesting that some state legislatures, including Georgia, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona, Nevada, some combination of those states, would have their legislatures convene and conclude, oh, under state law, it turns out the actual result is Trump won. Now, had they done that, that would have raised all sorts of additional questions. There might have been a role for Congress to consider. That didn't happen. But as we approached January 6th, especially after the first of the year, January 1st, January 2nd, the rumors continued to circulate. I couldn't get valid information from anyone about what the source of these rumors was. So I decided at that moment, somebody's got to figure this out. I started cold calling state legislators in Georgia, in Pennsylvania, in Wisconsin, and finding everything I could about the states in question. What I concluded was that there was not a single state in which a single house of the legislature was inclined to do that. The rumors were false. And on that basis, I concluded there's nothing for us to do, and I did not object to those elections. Now, the text message dump that came out yesterday, people actually read the text messages. They'll see that what I said on January 6th, when I gave my speech on the Senate floor explaining that, is exactly consistent with those text messages and consistent with the statement I released on December 16th after the electoral votes had been cast. And what they would see is somebody doing his job, somebody determined to follow the Constitution, and accordingly was willing to leave no stone unturned. I had to be able to figure out whether we had a role to play. And yet, already, you see the way that's been played. CNN, shockingly, didn't do a horrible job explaining it. It sort of was true to that. But two of my Republican opponents in this race, in addition to Evan McMullen, two of my Republican opponents have managed to get to the left of CNN, to the left of the New York Times on this issue, using progressive, liberal, democratic talking points that are not true. Accusing me of horrible things. Accusing me, somehow they turned me doing my constitutional due diligence into a crime against the Republic, which is difficult for me to understand. You know, there is a reason why Ronald Reagan articulated Reagan's 11th commandment. Remember that? You know, the good Republican shouldn't trash talk another Republican. One thing to highlight contrast, my opponent believes this, I believe this, and that's not trash talking. But there is a reason for that. When Republicans trash talk other Republicans, very often it's a sign they're just fine if a Republican doesn't win. And I wonder if that's what we're facing here.
Amen.